Our gospel passage today centers on another controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees. This time, they ask him, "What is the greatest commandment?" And we know he answers that it is love. But before we look more deeply at his response, we should take note that in English, we have only one word for love, and it's love. And we use it for everything. We say, "I love your dress," "I love my job," "I love my dog," and even, "I love you." In this last usage, we may clarify its meaning with an adjective such as carnal love or platonic love, but basically, we are limited to a single four-letter word to try to express the varieties and gradations of affection and passion that we have for someone or something. The ancient Greeks, while having thousands of words less in their vocabulary than there are in the English language, were much more nuanced in their expression of the word love, and used not one but three words to express themselves. The first word was eros, which means physical or carnal love, and it comes down to us in our word erotic. The second was philia, which means brotherly love, or the bond which is the foundation of friendship. This word is the root of the city named Philadelphia, which we translate as the city of brotherly love. The final word, which has no English equivalent, is agape. This word connotes a total and unconditional giving of self to the beloved, a love which always seeks the good of the beloved. It is this kind of love that Jesus is referring to in his answer to the lawyer's question, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" There were, after all, 613 laws to choose from. 248 were positive, "thou shalt," and 365 were negative, "thou shalt not." In response to the question, Jesus combines two laws from the Torah. The command to love God with one's whole heart, soul, and strength is found in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, the Shema, and it is recited twice a day by faithful Jews. The whole self is involved. The heart, considered the seat of the emotions, the soul, the center of vitality and consciousness, and strength or power. The command to love the neighbor is from the Holiness Code in Leviticus 19, which asserts that the way the love of God is made manifest is in the love we have for our neighbor. These are really not two separate commands, but rather two faces of the same love, two sides of the same coin. Scripture commentator Sister Barbara Reed points out that what is not explicit in this text, but appears in many other places in Scripture, is that God's love is always prior. Before one is able to demonstrate love of God and love of neighbor, God has taken the initiative in loving. Now that we again have the joy of celebrating baptisms, I always tell parents that they are pledging themselves to deepen and strengthen the relationship of their child, beginning with God through baptism. They can do this through a variety of ways. They can read their child Bible stories, teach them their prayers, bring them for their other sacraments, send them to religion classes. But I try to make it clear that before they do any of that, they are already teaching their children the most important thing about God, in that they love their child. And they love their child unconditionally. The baby hasn't done anything yet. The baby hasn't helped with the housework, hasn't done any homework from school, hasn't contributed to the household budget. The parents don't love their child for what they do. They love their child for who they are. Their love for their child is not predicated on what the child has done to earn that love. Their love is unconditional. And that's why a mother's love and a father's love is like God's love, because it comes first. We don't earn God's love. God always loves us first. When we realize this, when we become open to God's free, unmerited, unbounded love, then we have the capacity to give love in return. And that love has two objects which are inseparable: God and neighbor. When I saw the gospel assigned for this Sunday, I immediately went searching for a folder that I have in my filing cabinet. It's labeled Humor. and it contains jokes, cartoons, comic strips, etc. I was delighted to find one of my favorite comic strips. It's from The Wizard of Id. And it shows a preacher in the pulpit getting more excited as he waxes eloquently to his congregation on love. He starts out, "Love is where it's at, my children," going on to, "Love thine enemy, love thy neighbor, love one another," and finally shouting, "Love is the way." The final panel shows the preacher standing outside the church, shaking hands with the members of the congregation as they leave, and thinking to himself, "This is the part I hate the most." Ain't that the truth? As long as we keep love hypothetical, as long as we keep it an abstraction, love is the greatest thing in the world, and who wouldn't subscribe to it? But when we have to make it real, when we have to put it into practice, when we have to live it, well, then that's another story. Having been a minister at around 1,000 weddings over the past 48 years, I have probably heard what might be the most popular passage of the entire Christian scriptures read several hundred times. It's taken from the 13th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and it has often been called the hymn to love. You know it so well. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. It is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude, etc., etc., etc. The couples who choose this passage for their wedding ceremony are usually surprised when I point out to them that St. Paul was not a romantic and that he was writing this passage to the Corinthians because they were such a miserable bunch of people who just could not get along with each other. This nascent Christian community in Corinth had broken down into factions around several leaders. Each group claimed primacy and authority over all the others. What Paul is telling them is that love is, in fact, hard work. It means patience, kindness, not seeking one's own interest. Once I heard our weekend assistant, Monsignor Angelo Caligieri, preaching on this text. He wisely suggested that it can serve as a formula for any successful relationship, but it can also be trivialized by turning it into mere romantic platitudes. In order to avoid this, he suggested that one could examine one's success in realizing this inspiring vision of love's qualities by removing the word love from each phrase and inserting one's own name. Suddenly, these poetic, romantic, idealized sentiments become challenging and even arduous work. So let's take his advice and make the conclusion of this homily interactive. I'm going to read these familiar verses of the 13th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, but I'm going to pause slightly before each phrase, and you are going to say your name. You can say it out loud, or you can say it to yourself, but please join in. Ready? Okay. You begin. Say your name.
Claire.
Is patient.
Claire.
Is kind.
Claire.
Is not jealous.
Claire.
Is not pompous.
Claire.
Is not inflated.
Claire.
Is not rude.
Claire.
Does not seek his or her own interest.
Claire.
Is not quick-tempered.
Claire.
Does not brood over injury.
Claire.
Does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth.
Claire.
Bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things, never fails. It's quite an examination of conscience, isn't it? Again, keep it abstract and it's simple, but make it personal, make it the way you're trying to live, and that's the challenge. But because we are first and always loved by God, we are up to that challenge.